Good day friends, welcome to my channel. In this video I'll talk about Spring Security using basic authentication with a DB authentication. In the last video we have seen how to secure your REST endpoints with the Spring Security basic authentication with in-memory authentications. So in that video we have seen an application where we have created users as follows. Like you can see chef 1 with the roles as user L1 and with authorities as read write, and the another user chef 2 with roles as user L2 and authority as read, and another user chef 3 with just role user L3. And then we did not have any end matches here. We were validating each request, and we were using the password encoder as the bcrypt password encoder. And you can see that these are the endpoints that we have tested earlier. So each endpoint was having each global method level security, and we have tested with various authorities and roles. So we will be using the same endpoints in this video also. The only difference is that instead of using the in-memory authentication, we will be using the DB authentication. So let's see what all the tables required for this implementation. See, these are the tables required for it. So we'll have a user table where we will maintain the number of users, and there's a role table where we'll have the roles, and then you will have a role permission table where you will have the permissions mapped against each role. So in this table there will be multiple records for each role, and there is another table where we'll map each role to the user. So you can have one user can have more than one role here. So this is something based according to your requirement, so you can mix and match based on your needs. So in this tutorial I'll be using this format where you'll have a user table, role table, and you'll have a role permissions table, and then you'll have a user role table. Yeah, so let's flip to IntelliJ and start a new project. Alright, so let's create a new project. Go to File, New, Project, Spring Initializer, Next. Group ID should be chef Z, and the package name should be DB auth. Name Spring Security DB auth. That's it. Click next. So we need the Lembog and Spring Web. Now we'll be using H2 for this tutorial, so we'll add H2 dependency. Then we need JPA. Okay, so that's it for now, because we will add the Spring Security dependency later. Okay, so let's create the entities and all required first, and then we'll start with the security. Spring Okay, let's see the pom.xml. This is 2.2.6. okay, I'll make it 2.2.4 because these dependencies are already downloaded in my system, so it will be fast now. Alright, so now let's create some of the packages. First one we need is okay, controller domain repository and config. All right, so uh, the domains actually I have pre-prepared, so let me copy paste that. Okay, so let me walk through all these entities. Okay, the first we have the base entity. So base entity is nothing but uh, the base class for all other entities to inherit. So it is having the primary key. So these are the Lombok annotations, and then we'll have first one is the user. The user entity will have the string name and the password, and then for second one is a role, then it will just have the name, and the third one is role permissions. So this is an association entity where it will map the one role to a permission, so it can have this same role with multiple permissions. And then you will have the user role where will map a role to the user. So a user can have multiple roles, and a role can be mapped to multiple users as well. Yeah, so if you see in this example, we are not using two collections anyway, so we are using only the many to one. So that's why we are creating the association tables explicitly. Alright, so now let me copy the repositories as well. Right, let's see the user repository. So user repository extends the JPA repository and will take in the user and the string. Actually this is wrong. This should be primary key is actually integer, right? Then this is having a method which retrieve the user by the name, and then we'll have the role repository. Again this is wrong, integer. So there's no methods in this one. Then you'll have the role permissions repository where you'll have retrieve the records based on the role name, and then you will have the user role where you will retrieve all the user roles by the username. So these methods we will use to retrieve the roles and authorities for a particular user. Now let's configure the H2. To the resources, and let's rename the application dot properties to application dot YAML, and let me copy the properties. So the properties are simple, where it will run on 8082 port. Then you are configuring the data source URL. The username should be SA. Password, you don't need to specify any password actually. Then you will give the driver, and this will be the context path to reach the H2 console. That's it, the basic configurations. Okay, now let's implement the command line runner to add some records to these tables while the application is starting up. Okay, so we'll go to the Boot Security+Basic Auth application, and this will implement command line runner. Alright, so Control I, implement this. Now what we are going to do is we'll add some codes to insert data to our entities here when the application is starting up. Okay, so let me paste some code. Okay, now first let me auto-var all the repositories here. Alright. Role repository, then role role permissions repository. Now user role repository. Okay, so let's see what we have added here. The first one will take in a role name and the list of permissions, and then it will create the role. It will persist the role first, and then for each permissions, and it will create a role permission record. So it's pretty straightforward. And the second one, what it takes is it takes the username and the list of roles that should be attached to the user. So first it will create the user and then save the user, and for each roles passed in it will create a user role association record and save it. If you notice it here, we are not encoding the password here, because for the password encoder we need a Spring Security dependency, so we'll add it later. Okay, so now we need to call these methods. Alright, so you see the first one, we're creating user L1 with write, delete and read permissions. Next is user L2 with read authority permission, and next is user L3 role, which does not have any permissions. Then we'll create three users, chef 1, chef 2, chef 3, and with these roles. Alright, that's pretty straightforward. So let's start the application and see. Okay, so the application is up. Let's go to the H2 console and then see whether it has created something or not. Okay, localhost 8082/H2. Yeah, okay. So if this, when you do it for the first time, maybe the URL and username and password might not come here, so you need to enter it manually. Okay, so connect to it. Okay, so you can see that we have the tables created here. So let's see. Okay, so from the user it is present. There, role permissions, it's present, then the user role. Yeah, so all the required data has been saved correctly. So now what we do is that we'll go and create the rest of the items. Let's create the controller class first. annotate it with REST controller. Now we need two APIs here. One is to fetch all the users, and the second one is to fetch all the roles. So let me copy paste that. So what we have done here is we have authored the user repository and the role repository, and then we have a users API where you will just return user repository.findAll, and for the API slash roles endpoint we will just return role repository.findAll. Right, so let's go and create the configuration class. Okay, before that we need to configure the sprint security dependency. So let's go to the POM file and configure that. So I'm going to copy paste that. Alright, so now let's go back to the config class, and this should be extending web security configure adapter. Now let me annotate this with at configuration at enable web security at enable global method security is equal to true. Okay, next thing we have to override the configure method. First we will configure the HTTP security, where HTTP dot authorize request dot. Okay, so now we will add the AND matches. We never did this before in our previous video. So API slash users. So here what we could do is we can add the roles and authorities here itself. So in our previous video we have done it at the method level. So in this video also we will follow the same, but for this particular endpoint we don't need any authorities. So we want to permit all the users to access this endpoint. So we will just give as permit all. Same goes with roles. So okay, now for all other requests it should be authenticated and .http basic. Also we want to disable CSRF. That's it. Now let's configure the authentication manager builder. Control O and then configure authentication manager builder. Okay, so in the previous video we were doing the in-memory authentication, right? So but in this one we are doing the database authentication, so we need the authentication provider being here. Okay, so we need an authentication provider here. Okay, so what we do is at bean DAO authentication provider authentication. Okay, so new authentication provider, right? So what all these things it requires is, if you see you need a user detail service, and you need a password encoder. We don't need this password service here. So user detail service is an interface which we need to implement. Okay, so we'll do that, but before that we'll set the password encoder, and for that we need what a password encoder bean. We have done this before. Password encoder is the new bcrypt password encoder, right? So here we will just put password encoder. Now we return it, and here I will add the authentication provider. That's it. Now we need to implement the user details service. Okay, so let's go to the service. Okay, we don't have it yet, so let me create that package called service. Now we'll create my user details service, okay, which will implement user details service. Okay, and I will annotate it with service. Now I will implement the methods. Okay, so if you see, this interface is having only one method, which is load user by username. So what we need to do is we have to load the user, find the user with the username. Okay, so the first, and if you also notice that it is returning a user details. Okay, so let's see what it is. So this is an interface which is having these many methods. Okay, so this interface will return actually, you know, the authorities for that particular user. So what we will do here is the first one, we will auto-wire the user repository at auto-wired user repository. Now, okay, so here is user is which one we have done. We need to have, no, I think we have done a different user here. We don't need this. User is equal to user repository dot find by name. So we already have a method in user repository which retrieves the user by the name. Okay, so we'll pass it as here. Okay, now we need to implement this interface, right? So we'll go to the domain and then we'll create a new class called my user details, which implements user details. Okay, so here we will implement all the methods. Now we'll add this as all our constructor at builder. Okay, so these are Lombok annotations. Okay, also we need at data for the getters and setters. Now we also need private user. Why we need this? Because there are certain parameters which we can set it from here. See, for example, the get password. So what you do is user dot get password, which is already there, right? Here also user dot get name. All the other methods we will just return it as true because we don't have it in our user table, these fields. So if you are in actual real-time cases, we will configure this all the values in the table and then we'll retrieve it accordingly. So for this purpose we will just return everything as true. Okay, now we will where were we? We were in the service class. Sorry. Okay, now we will just return a new my user details and pass in this user. That's it. Okay, let's go back to user result. We did not configure what the granted authorities. Okay, so here is where we need to find out the roles and the authorities of this user. The first one, we need to find the roles of the user. Let's auto-wire user role repository and role permissions repository. So let me copy paste that code. Okay, so let's go through this code first. Okay, so this method will return a simple granted authority. Okay, so we'll create a array list for that, and then now we will return the roles as mapped to that particular user. So we'll call the find all by username on the user role repository, which this method we already have, and we'll pass in the username. Okay, then now we will loop through the roles. First we will add the we'll create an instance of the simple granted authority with the role name. So if you remember, we have discussed in the previous video, it's like if a user is having the roles and as well as permissions, you need to have the roles as well as the authorities to be added into the authority list, right? So that's what we are doing it for. First we'll add the roles into the list, and then we'll find out the permissions of that particular role. So we have retrieved that, and again we'll loop through that. For each permission we will create a simple granted authority and adding it to that list. Finally, so we'll have the roles and authorities for that particular user added to a list, and then we'll return the list. Okay, now we'll go back to the configuration class, and we'll auto wire this my user details service, and we'll set it here. Yes, that's it. So I think we are pretty much done with it. Okay, so we have a problem here because this is expecting other parameters as well, because we have added this repository later, so we need to provide an instance of this. Okay, so what we do is that we'll remove the auto-wire from here. Okay, and we'll just go back to here, user detail service, and then we'll have it here. Which one is this? Role permissions repository and user role repository. Okay, now what's the order in which we need to give is first a user role. Okay, so we'll give it as user role repository and role permissions repository. I think that solves the problem. You will have the builder, and okay, let's run the application and then see. Okay, so let's go to the Postman. So this is the API that we need to access, and you have selected the basic authentication and the username and the password, and let's hit the request. Yeah, we got the response. What did we get? See, chef 1, chef 2, chef 3, and this is the encrypted password, right? So that is working. Okay, so now let's try for the roles as well. So a slash API slash roles. Okay, so you have the roles list also here. So now both of our APIs are working. So what we do is we'll go back to the controller and we'll add the other REST endpoints. Go back to the controller. Okay, so let me copy the endpoints. Okay, so these endpoints are there from our previous project. I have changed the wording a little bit and also added, I think, this one extra. Okay, let's see what's the first endpoint. It says that any user with a write or delete permission can access this. Test 2 with authority as a read. Test 3 is for user with permission as delete. And test 4 is whichever user is having a role as user L1 can access this. Test 5 is for user L2, and test 6 is for user L3. Okay, so let's try start the application. To the Postman. API slash test 1. Okay, so yes, it's worked. So he is having access. Okay, let's try with chef 2. Error. Chef 3. Error, which is fine because what did we say is if you go back to the application, we said was user L2 is having access only the read, right? So the first API is for write and delete. We go back to the controller. So yeah, see, it says write and delete. That's why. Okay, so let me try it with the second API. Let's start from 1. Yep, he's having read access. Yes. Sorry. Here, if I put read access, yes. And the third one should not be able to. Yes, error. Cool. We'll put it as test 3 and let's put as chef 1. Yes, he's having delete access. Should not be. And right now, what's the fourth endpoint? Fourth endpoint is now onwards the role based. Okay, the fourth endpoint should be accessed only by the user chef 1. Should be having error. Should be error. Perfect. Let's try with fifth one. Go to the user 1. Should be error. Yes. Should enter. Perfect. No. So 3 here also was 5, right? Yeah. Error. Now the last endpoint. We'll try with one. There should be error. Chef 2 should be error. 3 should get in. Perfect. So we have tried with all our endpoints, and it is all working as expected. Now let's try to access the H2 console and see whether we are able to get in or not. Go to a new window, localhost 8082/H2, right? Okay, so it's asking for a password. Okay, let's put chef 1 and then 1 2 3 4, right? It's going in here and then connect. See, we were able to access it, but if you see that the Sprint security is blocking, and we'll add one here. Oh, there must be this one, web security. So what we have to do is web dot ignoring dot and matches slash h2 slash star star. So this means that any request coming in with slash h2 should be ignored by the Spring Security. Okay, so let's stop and restart the application again. Okay, so let's try it again. Here we go. So now we are able to get into the console without any security, right? So let's go back to the application and see what we have done so far. So what we started with was we created all the entities required, uh, and then we created the repositories. Then we define where we have some of the methods defined to retrieve the users based on their name and the roles. And then we had the controller where we had added these two initial endpoints to retrieve the users and the roles, and then we configure the security configuration. So we have initially permitted all the users slash users and slash roles to permit all the authenticated users, and then we created the authentication provider, and for that we have configured the user detail service where we were retrieving each user based on the name provided, and then we configure the user details, and in here we were retrieving all the users roles and the permissions, and then we'll create a collection of the granted authority and then return it. So this is what we have done, and I hope you like the video.